Autumn of 1798. Smoke lay low over the Kentucky lowlands, heavy as velvet, curling through the cornfields and pastures along the Green River. It was harvest season, and the land offered up its bounty too easily, as though eager to appease. But some fruits of the soil were not meant to be touched. That year, a plow blade turned up more than roots, first a child's scuffed leather shoe, then the curled edge of a human collarbone wrapped in rotting husk, like some strange pagan relic. It was no secret, not really, only a reminder of what the county had long agreed not to see. Above the valley, on the highest slope of Thornhill, the Walker farm stood serene and still, a square-jawed stone house with ivy on the windowsills and a roof of slate that seemed to never age. There was a long tobacco barn, its eaves darkened with time, 2 granaries that creaked even in windless air, and a family plot whose stones were better tended than the living. The locals said Mary Walker was a saint. She nursed the sick, fed the poor, and prepared the dead for burial with such tenderness that even the undertaker deferred to her. Her husband, Isaac Walker, was a man of clean boots and quiet arithmetic, the sort who never raised his voice but never misplaced a cent. His ledgers were always balanced. His smile, always practiced. Their sons built coffins. Their daughters stitched mourning shawls. Death was their trade, and they wore it like a well-tailored coat. Yet no one questioned it. The Walkers hosted harvest suppers, paid church dues in silver, and spoke of Providence with eyes lowered in reverence. Isaac carried a leather-bound almanac wherever he went, recording rainfall, crop yields, and, at the end of each autumn, one word in perfect script: harvest. The town did not fear them. Fear would have meant admitting the truth. They respected the Walkers. They relied on them. And they stayed quiet, even as the graveyard swelled, even as names vanished from land records, even as silence settled over certain houses with the permanence of mildew. Some places bury their dead. This farm, it seemed to grow them. He came from the east, through rain and cinder, walking with the patient gait of someone who had long since stopped waiting for warmth. His name was Andrew Clark, preacher by trade, witness by fate, and by the time he arrived in Henderson County, the autumn leaves had already begun to rot where they fell, the ground too wet for burning. His boots were cracked, his coat patched with threadbare prayers, and his Bible wrapped in oilskin, dog-eared and heavy. He wasn't a missionary, not exactly. Not anymore. Clark had buried a child that spring, not his own, but one he had taken under his roof during a fevered journey across the Ohio frontier. The boy, just 10, had sickened after a short stay with distant kin near the Green River. The death was sudden, the illness brief, and the burial perfunctory. Clark had seen death before. But never like that. Never so clean. It wasn't grief that troubled me, he later wrote in a letter to the Synod. It was the way the neighbors accepted it. Like the weather. As if death were a necessary chore, like cutting wood for the hearth. He asked around. Names. Histories. Patterns. And all trails, by coincidence or design, led back to Thornhill, to the Walker place. To Mary's soft hands and Isaac's polite ledger. The Walkers had been kind to the boy, he was told. He had passed peacefully. His small coffin had been built from the barn's own cedar. No one had charged Clark a cent. Gratitude was expected. Questions were not. Clark took lodging in a sagging room above the cobbler's shop in the town of Waverly, 2 miles south of the farm, close enough for visits, far enough to observe. Each morning, the fog sat thick along the riverbanks, turning the black locust trees into silhouettes. The town rose slowly with the sun, its people thin from work and heavy from tradition. They nodded at Clark, politely enough, though few made conversation. He was an outsider, and in Henderson County, outsiders listened before they spoke, if they spoke at all. The rhythm of the place soon revealed itself. Sundays were for church, Mondays for the bank, and Tuesdays for burials. Not every week, but often enough that Clark began to mark the pattern. It was subtle at first, a fresh patch of earth here, a new black ribbon there. The children whispered of sleeping barns and smoke that smells like sick. The local paper, the Waverly Standard, printed death notices without comment. No editorials. No inquiries. He began walking the roads himself, past sorghum fields and willow-choked creeks, keeping note of what he saw. The Walker farm drew visitors as often as the general store, widows, mostly, and old men with wheezing lungs, and occasionally children with rashes or boils. They entered tired. They left quiet. Clark watched their eyes. Watched how they avoided the gaze of others. The Walker place was immaculate. The tobacco rows stood rigid and identical, like soldiers in prayer. Chickens moved in choreographed clusters. No weeds. No rust. No smell of manure. The barn roofs were tarred and sealed. The windows gleamed. The smokehouse, oddly wide for its purpose, always exhaled a scent Clark could not place, not meat, not wood, but astringent, like alcohol soaked into decay. He tried conversation. A boy named Emery, who helped unload flour from wagons, spoke of the Walkers with reverence. "They know things," he whispered. "About the body. About rest. If you go there sick, you don't suffer long." Clark pressed. "Do they use medicine?" The boy hesitated, then shrugged. "They make teas. Tonics. But mostly they just know." At the churchyard, Clark noted the headstones. The oldest dated to 1769. The newest bore no dates at all, just initials and symbols, wheat stalks, crescent moons, sometimes nothing at all. Families buried kin in family plots. Except those who died at the Walker farm. Those had no visible relatives. Just initials and a date. Then there were the necks. Clark had seen too many funerals to be surprised by the dead. But these corpses, the ones brought from Thornhill, showed something else. A faint bluish ring just beneath the jawline, often obscured by lace or scarf. The skin around the mark held a rigidity that was not natural. Almost preserved. When questioned, the undertaker, Mr. Levi Dokes, claimed it was just the cold. "But it's not cold yet," Clark replied. Dokes looked away. "Autumn's early this year." That night, Clark dreamt of a rope made of roots, wrapping slowly around his neck, pulling him not upward, but downward, into soil that whispered his name in warm, wet syllables. He began to read at night, old land deeds, loan records, birth registries. The Walkers appeared in all of them. Isaac signed off on purchases, on inheritances, on burial taxes. Mary's name appeared in the Women's Guild ledgers, the charity rosters, the parish nurse records. But never as recipients. Only providers. And every 5 years, more land, often traded for little, sometimes for nothing. The preacher's instincts told him to preach. But his conscience told him to wait. If he accused, the town would defend. They were bound by favors, by unspoken debts. He needed evidence. A witness. He needed someone who had seen. She had lived in the valley so long that people no longer used her name, only called her the Boone woman, or simply Letty. Midwife, widow, suspected root worker, occasional healer, Letty Boone had helped deliver more children than the county registrar could count, and bury nearly as many. Her small cabin crouched between a willow grove and the river's curve, roof bowed like a tired back, and herbs drying in every window. In town, people crossed themselves when she walked past, but they also came knocking when sickness came sudden and real. She did not speak often. She did not need to. Letty's hands, knotted, stained, yellowed from lye and pokeweed, spoke more clearly than her tongue ever had. When Andrew Clark came to her door in late October, she did not ask his name. She poured boiled chicory into 2 mismatched cups and sat down on the porch as though she had known he would come. Clark showed her nothing. Said little. Only mentioned the Walker farm. That was enough. Letty stared into the trees for a long moment, then reached down and pulled from beneath the porch a small box, black walnut, polished with care. She held it gently, not like a secret, but like a wound. She opened the lid without ceremony. Inside, 2 locks of hair, bound with green twine. A ring tarnished silver, etched with 3 notches. A scrap of brocade, dark with age and something else, rust blood or tincture. Beneath them, folded paper, old, smudged, with writing that time had nearly erased. Only fragments remained. Fever broke on Sunday, couldn't cry, promised not to ask. Clark lifted the brocade. A smell hit him, salt, brine, and wild sage, and something colder underneath, like root cellar air or the breath before death. These all come from one place? He asked. Letty nodded. And you kept them? She met his eyes then. Hers were the color of old ash, the whites veined with yellow. Not for me. Clark did not ask for more. He returned the items gently, as if closing the lid on a coffin. Over the next weeks, Letty let him return, not often, not long. She spoke in fragments. Stories that never named names but described a pattern too familiar to be dismissed. She had been summoned to the Walker farm more than any other, sometimes to birth, more often to clean. Her hands had prepared dozens of bodies. Always alone, she murmured. Always quick. They never let kin linger. She had seen things. Blue powder dusted into tea. Weeping that stopped too suddenly. Children who seemed strong one day, dead the next. They say it's the air, she said once. But that ain't air. That's remedy. Clark asked about the burials. Letty's mouth pinched. The barn's got 2 levels, she said. Only one's for drying tobacco. He didn't press. But that night, he walked up the ridge past the Walker fences, keeping to the trees, stepping soft. The barn loomed dark against the sky, the smokehouse chimney still exhaling a thin white stream. The moon showed a sliver of the yard, too neat, too empty. But near the back, where the slope dipped, movement. A child, maybe? No. Too steady. A figure dragging something. A bag, a box, no sound but the rasp of wood on dirt. Clark did not approach. Not yet. He returned the next morning to Letty. Found her porch empty, tea cold in the pot. The cabin's door swung slightly ajar. Inside, signs of struggle, but subtle. A stool knocked over. One broken jar. The black walnut box was gone. No one in town knew, or claimed to know, what had happened. Sheriff Griggs, said she, probably wandered off. That her heart wasn't strong. But Clark saw her boots still neatly placed by the hearth. And her herbs all harvested, freshly tied. No one leaves their shoes behind in October. At her burial, for a body was eventually found downriver, waterlogged and too pale, no family attended. Clark stood alone beside the shallow grave, watching the dirt fall like denial. The preacher spoke no sermon. Only whispered one word. Testimony. 2 days later, Clark entered the Walker barn. Not in daylight, not by invitation. He waited until dusk, when the family left for the church harvest supper. He crossed the fields with mud to his knees, lantern held low. Inside smelled of cedar and something sharper, acrid, like dried citrus or formaldehyde. The ground floor was clean, swept, rows of tobacco strung overhead. But there, behind a stack of drying racks, a false wall. He pried it loose. Behind, a corridor, narrow and dim. Shelves. Dozens. Small boxes, each labeled not with names, but with field names. Lower Meadow. Maple Edge. Clay Hollow. Each box contained tokens, ribbons, marbles, teeth. One held a rusted pocketknife Clark had seen before, Timothy Boyd's, the boy who'd run off last spring. He stepped deeper. The smell thickened. At the far end, a table, black oak, scratched with strange marks. Letters? Numbers? No, dates. Next to it, a hook, from which hung the leather-bound almanac. He opened it. Inside, the entries were clinical. Measured. JM, 6 years, cough, willow tonic, full release in 2 days. CT, widowed, no kin, prepared with belladonna, extraction successful. Clark flipped back years. Years. Each autumn marked by the same word. Harvest. He heard nothing. But he knew he wasn't alone. He backed out, replaced the wall, fled across the field, pulse in his ears. At the edge of the corn rows, he turned once. The barn remained still. But a candle had appeared in the upper window. He didn't sleep that night. Only read. And wept. Because what he held wasn't evidence of murder. It was something worse. A system. It began to reveal itself not like a confession, but like mold, spreading where the light didn't reach, emerging in corners too long ignored. Clark no longer guessed. He studied. He cross-referenced. He learned the way corruption roots itself in silence, and grows only when fed by need. Parish records became his scripture. He read them like gospel, baptisms, marriages, burials. The rhythm was wrong. Too many endnotes, not enough beginnings. For every wedding held in the county, there were 3 funerals. More troubling, how many names ended with land transfers, property left unclaimed, debts forgiven, holdings reassumed by agreement. The common detail? The executor listed was often Isaac Walker. Clark mapped it, literally. Parchment spread across the table in his room above the cobbler's shop, pins marking each known death from the last 6 years. With ink, he traced the holdings that changed hands afterward. A pattern formed, not in circles but in spindly fingers, reaching out from Thornhill in all directions like a creeping root system. A death here. A land transfer there. A charitable gift from Mary. Then a funeral. Always in that order. He found more in the church logbook, one he had been given access to only after offering to restore its spine. Between the dust and rot of its pages, he noticed the entries made by different hands. The neatest, always the most troubling, belonged to Mary Walker. She signed for the parish's Poor Relief Fund 6 times a year, almost always after a new burial. Clothing and care for the indigent, she wrote. Burial provisions for the unloved. Always neatly categorized. Always with receipts. The town, he realized, had been trained, not deceived. Trained to feel relief at the Walkers' presence, as if their attention was a mercy. Trained to associate the family with kindness. But Clark now saw that the charity was the cover. The smile that followed the sin. He returned to the barn again, this time during a rainstorm that masked his footsteps. No candle this time. Just the moan of old timber, and the drip of water from the eaves. Inside, everything had been moved. The boxes were gone. The table wiped clean. The almanac missing. But one thing remained, a stain. Fresh resin smeared across the floorboards, as if something had been sealed again in haste. Clark knelt. The resin hadn't cured. It smelled of turpentine and roots. He tapped the boards with the butt of his lantern. Hollow. No time to pry further. He left before the storm cleared. The next morning, on his doorstep, a bundle. 3 corn cobs tied with red twine, and the twine knotted in the shape of a hangman's loop. A warning. Later that day, he opened the church door to find something laid across his pulpit, a bird's tongue, dried, split, neatly placed on linen. The symbolism eluded him, but the message was clear. Speak, and you are next. Even the town began to change. Faces closed. Children no longer greeted him. A coldness slid into the glances of the townsfolk, not aggression, but withdrawal. The silence of people who had remembered, suddenly, that safety sometimes meant forgetting. Clark met with Reverend Talcott, the aging pastor who had long kept to ceremonial duties while letting Mary handle most matters of the poor. The man looked weary, his fingers trembling as he poured tea. I've seen your notes, Talcott said softly, not meeting Clark's eyes. They are thorough. Then you understand what's happening. I understand the dead are gone, and the living must still eat. Clark stood. You fear them. Talcott gave a dry laugh. I fear hunger. And memory. The Walkers are efficient. The land prospers. Most here believe that's enough. Clark could not disagree, not logically. But the soul, he thought, is not kept by logic. It is kept by witness. He took another route. At the county clerk's office, he borrowed ledgers under the pretense of researching family genealogies. What he found instead were probate declarations, dozens, marked with Mary's name as the witness and Isaac's as the executor. All legal. All tidy. But too many for one family to handle. He studied the signatures. Many identical. The same swoop of M, the same lazy curl of the Y. He traced back a dozen wills signed by people who, supposedly, could not write. Marked by hand, and yet all bore the same handwriting. Forged. Systematically. That night, he returned to the path that led behind the Walker house, not the barn, but past the smokehouse, where the ground sloped into a low clay pit. What he saw there froze him. Fresh dug earth. Neat rows of shallow trenches, each no more than 4 feet deep. Just enough to turn earth without suspicion. Just enough to hide quickly. He dug one, quietly, with a borrowed shovel. 18 inches down, burlap. Beneath that, a crate. And inside, not a body. Worse. Small labeled jars. Dark fluid. Hair clippings. Fingernails. Teeth. Preserved parts. Tagged with initials and weight. Date of harvest. He replaced everything. Covered the hole. Took one tag with him. M.E., age 11, liver clean, strong bile. Clark knew the name. Margaret Elling, the girl who died last fall of childbed fever, though she'd never bled. In the morning, he walked to the general store, asked to speak to the town magistrate. About what? Asked the clerk, voice flat. Evidence, Clark said. Of what? Of something worse than murder. That afternoon, 2 men waited outside his room. Not the sheriff. Not officials. Locals, holding axes like they were born to them. Clark did not return that night. He hid in the church loft. There, in the dark, he wrote a list of names. A plan. The autumn fair was coming, a time when all would gather. He would not bring another sermon. He would bring proof. And let the land speak for itself. The morning frost arrived early that year, curling silver fingers through the grass behind the church and leaving even the tobacco leaves stiff with ice. The first bells of the autumn fair rang out on a bitter wind, and in their tolling, Clark heard opportunity and doom. The fair was always held on the church lawn and the adjoining market green. It drew farmers from neighboring counties, traders from as far as Paducah, even a few showmen from the Mississippi flatboats. It was the one time of year when everyone came together in one place, all eyes, all ears, and the one chance Clark had to make them see what they'd refused for so long. He had a plan. He would gather what remained, the tag from the trench, the altered signatures, the stolen probate entries, and the single surviving list of field names from his last barn visit, smuggled from the ledger before it vanished. And he would speak. Not from the pulpit, but from the fair's crude auction stage, where livestock were usually paraded. There, he would unroll the parchment and speak each name aloud, not the names of the dead, but the names of the lands they had become. Because here, land was remembered more than people. He would say, Clay Hollow, Maple Edge, Dry Crossing. And the farmers would flinch, recognizing not strangers, but themselves. But time, Clark knew, had begged *N to move against him. The Walkers were preparing. Each day, new smoke rose from the far side of Thornhill, not from the hearths, but from the clay pits. Herbs were laid in sheaves and boiled in great copper kettles. Oxen delivered barrels covered with wax seals to the back of the barn. The preparations were no longer subtle. Clark watched from a distance, moving only at night, his face now half known in town, suspiciously absent from his own boarding house, absent from church, absent from the stores. The preacher had become a shadow. And those who saw him averted their eyes, afraid of what might be following him. He tried to warn the magistrate again, but the door remained locked. The sheriff would not meet his gaze. Even Reverend Talcott, once sympathetic, now offered only a hollow look and a shake of the head. They know, Clark muttered. They all know. But knowing and acting, those are different things. The Walkers, sensing disruption, began sealing their circle. Mary stopped appearing in public, sending Ruth instead, the youngest daughter, barely 17, with a quiet face and hands always folded. She moved through the town like a messenger, bringing herbs, goods, donations to the church pantry, all without speaking. Clark saw her once near the dry creek, standing over a set of rabbit snares. She didn't lift her head. Didn't move. Just waited until he passed. He began to think she might be the key. The others had committed. Mary and Isaac were architects of this long game, the ledger keepers. The sons built, the daughters stitched, and Ruth? She watched. She learned. Could she be turned? He left a note near the snares, folded into a crevice of limestone. No signature. Just a line. The field remembers what the house forgets. She did not reply. But the snares were removed the next day. The next morning, the county turned quiet. Too quiet. Doors closed at mid-morning. Shutters latched at noon. Dogs no longer barked when wagons passed. Children no longer played near the road. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the leaves. That evening, Clark returned to the trench field behind the barn. The clay was freshly turned, but no longer loose. The pits had been reinforced with sod and boards packed tight with wet mud. He found drag marks, wheel grooves, movement of heavy cargo. From a nearby tree, he watched the barn as figures moved inside. No lanterns. Just a dull glow from the hearth, and silhouettes crossing past it. At least 6 people, all working in rhythm. Preparing for something final. He approached one granary under the cover of night, and pried loose a lower board. Inside, bundles of hemp rope. Clay urns sealed with wax. A table. On the wall, a sheet of paper pinned with thorns, hand-drawn body diagrams, each marked with circles along the neck, spine, and gut. Dosage notes. Measurements. Clark took it and fled. He could no longer wait. That night, in the woods near the market green, he buried half his papers in a watertight box beneath a sycamore knot. The other half he folded into his coat. He would speak with what remained. Even if they stopped him. Even if they laughed. He rehearsed the names. Lower Meadow. Maple Edge. Sparrow Ridge. Clay Hollow. His voice cracked. He saw their faces as he spoke, not the living, but the lost. Children with string dolls. Old women with linen bonnets. Field hands with coughs too wet. All of them absorbed by that place. And then, footsteps. A figure approached, slowly, across the frost-bitten clearing. Clark stiffened, ready for a blow. But it was Ruth. She said nothing at first. Then she reached into her apron and handed him a folded slip of paper. In delicate, precise handwriting. They mean to finish before the first frost. 3 nights. The gathering begins tomorrow. They are already preparing the altar. Clark looked up, but she was already walking away. He whispered after her. Why? She did not turn, but her shoulders trembled. That night, Clark did not sleep. He paced the churchyard in circles, clutching his coat, watching the fog roll in from the green river like breath from some waiting mouth. He would not be ready. But perhaps, either were they. The sky lowered like a lid, pressing down on the valley until the land itself seemed to hold its breath. A storm crept across the fields that morning, slow, patient, full of waiting. By mid-afternoon, the clouds hung heavy with rot-colored light, turning the green river to slate and casting the woods in bruised hues. Birds vanished. Even the insects stilled. And by dusk, the wind returned, sharp, sudden, and cold as regret. Andrew Clark walked. Not toward the town, but through the fields, down into the hollow where the air turned sour and the earth throbbed underfoot. His lantern flickered, barely holding its flame against the gusts, but he did not stop. Each step forward felt like trespass, like sacrilege. But he had already crossed that line. There was no sermon left. No saving grace. Only the truth, raw and grim, and the task of bringing it into the light, however dim it might be. The Walker barn loomed ahead, black against the storm sky, its outline trembling in the gusts. No sound of livestock. No scent of hay. Only the distant pulse of drums, low, like thunder filtered through wood. Clark crouched near the tobacco rows, hidden by the swaying stalks, and watched. Figures moved inside. The door had been replaced with double panels reinforced with iron struts. It was not built to keep animals in. It was built to keep something out. Clark moved to the rear, where the earth sloped toward the pits. The trench lids were gone. Now great brass urns stood at their edges, pouring smoke, blue and acrid, into the air. A ritual. A fumigation. He covered his mouth and pressed on, slipping behind the granary and up the slope to the barn's rear window, already cracked. He climbed through. Inside, the air struck him like a wall, dense with herbs, oil, and something deeper, something chemical, pungent, unnatural. His lantern faltered. He held it close to his chest and took in the scene. The barn's floor had been stripped to packed earth. At the center, a great black oak table, bound with braided leather cords. Beside it stood Isaac Walker, shirtless, his body painted with a rust-colored resin, symbols inked in along the spine and shoulders. He held a small blade, not steel, but obsidian, and moved it slowly through the air, as though slicing smoke. Around him stood the family. Mary stood over a steaming vat, stirring a thick brown liquid with a yew wood staff. Her face was expressionless, eyes glassy with focus. Her apron was soaked through, not with blood, but with syrupy oil. Ruth knelt by a crate, sorting small glass jars filled with bone ash and powders. Two sons, Thomas and Eli, carried in another figure, a young man, unconscious, limbs slack. Clark stepped forward. His boots scraped against a plank. Isaac turned, slow and measured. "Well," he said. "I wondered when you'd arrive." Mary did not flinch. Ruth froze halfway to standing. Clark raised the lantern high. "It ends tonight." Isaac smiled, thin and humorless. "It never ends. It only seasons." He made a motion toward the table. The brothers dropped the body onto the cords, began strapping it down. The boy moaned faintly. Clark stepped forward, hand to his coat, gripping the flask of spirits he'd brought, lamp oil mixed with lye, enough to set the barn alight. "You call it harvest," he said. "But it's feeding. You've been processing lives like grain. Bottling souls." Mary looked up at him, eyes soft with something like pity. "No one mourns the calf when the pantry's full," she said. "We kept them. Preserved what would rot. We gave the dying a purpose." Clark struck a match. The flame hissed, trembling. Isaac raised the blade. "No closer," he said. "This isn't your altar. This isn't your God." "I have no God left," Clark whispered. He hurled the flask. It shattered against the edge of the vat, dousing Mary's apron and the floor in flammable oil. The flame followed instantly, leaping across the ground like hunger. Screams erupted. The vat cracked. Fire gushed up toward the rafters, catching on the bundles of tobacco strung above. The barn came alive with light. Isaac lunged for the ledger, the almanac, still hanging from a hook by the far wall. Clark blocked him, grabbing the man's wrist mid-stride. The obsidian blade slashed across Clark's shoulder, burning like ice. He cried out and slammed his fist into Isaac's face, staggering the older man. The flames climbed faster now, up the beams, across the roof. Mary tried to smother her burning apron, but the resin spread like tar. Ruth screamed for her. "Mother!" but could not cross the fire line now raging between them. Clark staggered to the table. The boy, barely conscious, blinked up at him. Clark cut the straps. The building groaned. Wood split overhead. A beam crashed behind them, nearly crushing the granary crates. Glass shattered. Smoke boiled from the rafters. Isaac rose again, blood on his teeth. He reached for the almanac. Clark didn't stop him, not this time. Let him cling to his scripture, he thought. Let the fire be the final page. He grabbed the boy and dragged him toward the side door, the one hidden behind the back feedroom. The exit where livestock once fled. They burst through just as the roof collapsed. The barn gave one long, sighing moan, and then it went down. The night turned orange. The smoke carried not the scent of wood or hay, but of bitter oil and charred herbs, and something else, something Clark could never describe, only remember, the sharp, hollow scent of ritual ending. He turned once. Through the flickering haze he saw Ruth still standing near the fire's edge, face lit by flame, unmoving. Watching. Remembering. Morning came thick and gray, carrying with it the smell of ash and unspoken things. The valley lay heavy under a film of smoke, and the barn was now nothing more than a blackened carcass, its ribs caved inward, timbers still steaming in places. Where once tobacco hung and mixtures simmered, there remained only ruin and memory. The townspeople gathered as they always did, not with torches or questions, but with silence. They stood in half circles around the ruin, clutching coats to their chests, eyes squinting against the rising light. No one spoke. No one asked? They looked not at the ashes, but at each other, as if expecting to be named, accused, or perhaps absolved. Clark arrived after the fire had cooled. His shoulder was bandaged, his coat torn, his boots blackened with soot. He held under one arm a box, salvaged from the rear granary, the only one not consumed. Inside, the tokens remained intact, field names etched on tags, locks of hair, bits of cloth. The box smelled of clay and old grief. He set it down on the grass, opened the lid, and stepped back. Some came forward. One man knelt, lifted a token marked Maple Edge, and went pale. Another recognized a button from a brother's coat. A woman wept, whispering a name no one else had spoken in years. Others turned away. One by one, Clark read the names aloud, not the dead, but the places. That was how the town would understand. Not through grief, but geography. He called them out like scripture. Lower Hollow. Sparrow Field. Elm's Turn. Widow's Bank. Each name fell like a bell toll, dull and slow. Each carried its own weight. And the wind, rising again, carried the ash across the rows of corn, where nothing would grow the same again.